Not sure that it's never going to be cheesy, Al. It's always going to be cheesy, isn't it? But yeah,
Right.
morning, Daniel. Thank you for joining us. Daniel Sawko is the CEO and founder of Shipshape.vc, which, from what I know of it and what we've seen, Daniel seems to be very, very well connected in multiple countries across the world now. So thank you for taking the time to join us this morning.
Thanks very much, Matt. Yeah, thanks
First
so much.
question, it would be, what encouraged you? What was the thinking behind it? I'm going to create this platform to join all these venture capitalists and angel investors and startups together. What made you sit back and think to create it?
I made a mistake, and I said yes to a project that the CEO of the company I was then working for gave me. So she wanted to raise a 5 million Series A for a technology company that was building essentially in the space of regulatory technology. And she said, "Oh, Daniel, you're good at research. Please go find which investors we should speak with." I thought, well, how hard can that be? There's the internet, and I'm sure that there are good tools out there. And tools, though, that I found were not that helpful. They were very expensive in some instances, and they didn't really help find the investors that really understood the space that we're in. And that's critical. If you're going to quickly bring someone up to speed with what you're doing in your business, ideally you'd like the gap between their knowledge and the knowledge about what you're doing to be as small as possible. And it also indicates an active interest. It's much easier for someone to invest in something that they understand and care about than if it's totally new to them and they actually couldn't give a flying monkeys about that particular area. And so that's where the idea came from. So I thought, well, if we're suffering from this, there are going to be lots of other people in lots of industries, educational technology included, who are not quickly joining the dots between what it is that they're doing and the investors that they ought to speak with. So yeah, we basically, me and my co-founder actually met at that company, and I described the problem to him and thought, yeah, actually, that's a real problem. Let's see if we can go solve it. And we have ended up creating a search engine that we've trained to look on a narrow part of the web where we can see investment activity, and we enable companies, founders to search through that for free. And they can search through something like 24,000 funds, 130 something thousand investments, just to see who they might want to go and approach.
Wow. I was going to ask, Matt, I'm just interested, this is within the concepts of this podcast, we talk education, but I wear another hat, chairing the business board and sit on that combined authority for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, one of the new mayoral authorities. And one of the big focuses and areas is all about investment and growth, how we grow, particularly within the tech sector, as well as biotech, the kind of Cambridge-centric research hub. But one of the challenges always seems to be there are so many places where you could access funding and investment, but it seems almost impossible to try and figure out which is the route to access. And I always use the old Donald Rumsfeld thing. It's not the known knowns or the known unknowns. It's the unknown unknowns. So I guess your focus is is signposting what people don't know is out there. But at the same time, how do you identify which are perhaps more active than others? Do you provide any kind of sense of these are people that are much more active in the space, or is it kind of a flat list of those potential resources?
Yeah, so we actually, it's a really good question, because one of the frustrations that I had and continue to have with sort of resources that are out there, they're often list-based, and you can't get a sense for, okay, actually, how active is that investor? Have they raised themselves recently? So do they have an active fund that they need to deploy from? And so one of the features within the search engine is actually a chart. It's a time series, and on it we plot where we see that fund has participated in an investment round, and also when they themselves have raised a fund. So it gives our users a sense of, okay, how active are they, and at what level of funding round do they normally participate in? You'll always end up with a few outliers, but usually funds like participating in a round of a certain size, and that's where they usually play, at least with their initial investments. They might do follow-ons at bigger round sizes, but actually it's a really good way of visually displaying valuable information to users that's not in a list format that you couldn't interpret even if you wanted to. So that's really what we're trying to do, is sort of bridge that gap and level that information asymmetry to enable our, those people who are building the future to not spend quite so much time on finding out who they should be speaking with.
Just think to that. So in education, Daniel, I mean, Al and I share a frustration that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, whereas my school will be very, very different to the vast majority, if not all, schools in London, and vice versa, and across the country. And you and I have spoken before about importance of regional startups and regional innovation and regional hubs. How does Shipshape.vc, work with that within regions? Because I imagine if a company is based in Cumbria as opposed to London, will there be certain pots of money and access funds and VCs and whatnot that won't consider it or will prioritise that over others? Or how does that work?
Yes, I think this is a very clear example of like market failure, where actually being geographically dislocated from centres of capital has a real downside impact on the level of funding that's available. And the UK government has actually done a good job of recognising that, and they've essentially allocated via the British Business Bank regional funds, and those regional funds have a regional remit, and they basically are charged with dispersing that money and essentially acting as the supply of capital for the companies that are in that region, the entrepreneurs in that region, so that they can go and raise. Now, I think our data shows that those who are raising sort of outside London, Southeast, and there are the other patches where things look really quite good as well. So places like Edinburgh and Bristol also have like relatively low dilution rates for a given round size. And by dilution, what I mean is when you're raising capital, you need to sell part of your business. And the lower the rate of dilution, the smaller the chunk of your company that you have to sell. And so like the further removed you are from those centers of capital, actually, the more of your company you have to sell for a given amount. And so that is something that we see. It's one of the things that we actually think that we help to solve, because if you're, let's say you're building an educational technology company in, let's say Cumbria, if you can do something that maximizes the number of interested investors, not just your regional fund, but actually other educational technology investors around the world who really care about what you're doing, you're going to get a much better price. In the same way that if you've got multiple bidders on your house, you'll probably get a better price than if you just have one.
Okay. Just on that theme, Daniel, we can take a theoretical. Matt and I are setting up a company, and we've got the choice between Cumbria and Boulder, Colorado. Very different in terms of the investment landscape and technology. Is there a different search if you're a startup versus a scale-up? If you're looking to invest your own capital versus sweat capital? How nuanced do people need to be to understand what's the right fit for their business?
That's a really good question. So in terms of, I guess, choice of location, obviously, think carefully about if there are local incentives that you can take advantage of, particularly around things like grants, that's obviously very helpful. And that can make a real difference in the early stages where actually you're still validating. You're at the riskiest stage of your business, and you might need some funding to validate whether or not the idea is a goer and whether or not people in the market will pay for it, which, granted, within the field of education is a very long buying cycle usually, and lots of persuading to do, including at multiple levels of government potentially, which is really hard. With regards to the nuances between sort of capital for equity versus work or sweat for equity, that really does depend on the business and the gaps that they've got versus the individual and what they can potentially offer in exchange for helping to grow that business. Because ultimately, if that individual is really going to help grow the business and they bring a particular set of skills, perhaps not Liam Neeson, but not far off within that world, that's worth something. Now, you can't go down to your local Sainsbury's or Curry's and change that sweat into, like, let's say, a laptop for a new employee. And that's why actually sweat equity often is not valued as highly, even on a sort of time for value exchange. So let's say you've got a consultant who would charge a £500 day rate, £500 of equity versus £500 for equity it's not quite the same value proposition, because actually, money in your bank account is much more fungible for a business, and very often actually that ability to exchange it for a variety of goods and services is valued far more highly than actually a day's work from someone, if that makes sense.
Within education, Daniel, there's accountability frameworks, whether you're primary, secondary, maths, whatever, whether it's stats, progress 8, Ofsted, the big O word, call them other things at other times, but I mean, there has to be some accountability. That does sort of limits innovation within schools. School leaders find it difficult, I think, to step away from those frameworks, understandably, sometimes to innovate. You referenced the government doing a good job earlier on, which we don't seem to hear very often nowadays, but is there a sufficient innovation within the EdTech or the technology sector in the UK to support innovation?
So I don't think so. Would be my honest answer. I think that there are. I think it's very difficult for those working in finance on a tight budget within schools to find the excess capital to potentially invest in deploying a new and untested system.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think given the pressures that educational establishments are under in terms of budget and funding, I think that's very difficult, and becomes more difficult when you think, okay, well, how is that person's performance going to be measured in a year's time? And what is the safest thing for them to do from a job security perspective? Not rocking the boat is unfortunately likely to be the default position. And I think that's something is going to change, whether or not education is changing, regardless of whether or not schools are going to change with it. The access to online large language models, etc., is going to give rise to.
Already is, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're correct. Yes. Yeah. And everything from sort of at work learning, for people like myself, like I'm not actively enrolled in any courses at the moment, but utilizing LLMs to find out more about certain subjects is something that I do every day now. Now that's completely changed how much information and knowledge I'm able to consume on a daily basis. That's going to be filtering its way downstream as well in terms of earlier year groups. So yeah, I think the world is going to change, and it's, will the institutions move with the world, or do they expect essentially to be sort of your last holdouts, like the Japanese soldiers 40 years after the war had ended, sort of in a Pacific jungle?
Al has a very good book coming out about this, which is, it's all about that, isn't it, really? It's that we've got a traditional education system and they're doubling down on it almost. It feels like we're going to stick with our traditional education system, even though the evidence, whether it's attendance, innovation or anything else, is that it really isn't going to work for much longer.
It's a funny one, isn't it? I gave it great thought and then ended up just calling it the awkward questions in education, because that's fundamentally what it is. And there is a sense, I'd say it's the same when it comes to companies. There's a natural persuasion in education that those at the coalface can see it's not the right fit and the world is moving on and we need to change the curriculum and the way we engage with young people. But it's just easier to tinker at the edges or be seen to put some more funds into something that just isn't the right structure and format. And there is an argument within the technology space that many of the tools that are educational technology are long past where the need is in the classroom now or in the school building, but it's easier to do a fresh UI update or a reskin of a feature than it is to start and do again. I often talk about books by Clayton Christensen in terms of digital disruption and that need that every year you create a product, you add features based on ideas, based on feedback from schools, and to respond to competitors. And after about 5 or 6 years, the product you offer is far more than what the customer, the educator, really needs. And you kind of have to digitally disrupt and reset to a different format. And post-pandemic, I think we've seen that increasingly. Instead of looking at which product's got the most features for the money, people look at which product is the easiest to use, the most secure, the most scalable, the most inclusive, the most flexible. Which one can teachers get their hands around and be innovative with as quickly as possible? And that changes the mindset. And it kind of leads on to the bit I wanted to unpick with you, which is, education's rapidly changing. And yet post-pandemic, there's a little bit of a deflation of the EdTech bubble from an investor point of view. Whether it's the market multipliers we've seen, the market seems to have shifted much more to a clustering model. We'll acquire other businesses as part of a portfolio of tools, and we're in effect buying revenue across the cluster. But in some countries, there's a different perception and there's a different ecosystem that really supports that. So I suppose the question is, were I an educator who thinks, I want to step from the classroom, I've got this amazing idea. Do you see the market as receptive now as it was? Do you see the market growing in terms of opportunities, or is it becoming more challenging with, frankly, so many AI-powered, wrapper-based solutions that are appearing on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I can't speak with that much confidence about the education sector, in particular from a buyer perspective, but certainly in terms of, if you think about the inevitable march forwards, I think it's one of the most logical areas in which the rapid progression of LLMs and their availability to members of the public like you and I, that inevitably that's just going to change the way that where we spend time and indeed where we spend money is going to have a downstream impact on where investors want to allocate their funds. And I think that shift is like, it's not going to go unnoticed by investors in terms of thinking, okay, yes, these are sort of wrappers around those those LLMs, but actually, like, this team is the one that I back to solve the question of distribution and accessibility within those schools. So a hypothesis, I think a totally reasonable hypothesis would be leveraging that new technology, putting an education wrapper around it, and then combining that with people who actually understand the way that people make purchasing decisions within the field of education. And unfortunately, I think that probably in the long run plays out like one or several of the larger players incorporating it and offering into their suite of products that they sell, because these organizations are perhaps the ones that have got the established relationships with the purchasing departments and are probably better able to, at scale, drive adoption. And that's just a hypothesis from a largely outsider to this industry.
There's a key point there that you mentioned, Daniel, which I think is really interesting, because much like people say, so AI and technology is going to come in the classroom and replace teachers. And if you take that perspective, you're a fool. But we can take the same view with what you shared there. When it looks like a proposition for a solution, it's not just the technology. It's about the people and the team that are wrapped around it. That's, in effect, the bit that gives the confidence or not as to whether this is going to go somewhere and be worthwhile. So in a way, while we always end up talking about the new shiny technology that's coming in, there's as much about the value of the human capital that's within our proposition and proposal, I guess, from what you're saying.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think actually from a teaching perspective, knowing like one of the greatest sort of areas for dissatisfaction in terms of my own educational experience within the UK school, the English schooling system, was sort of, it was very much, here's what you learn, and then you repeat it in a certain format to these questions in a certain structure in your exams. And it was not that questions were actively discouraged, but you were not allowed to meander off into areas of interest that you wanted to pursue about a particular topic. And I think actually that sort of, we're going to railroad you into a certain body of knowledge is largely a function of the limited resources that are actually available to the school. So they've got to make sure that all the children are following, all the kids are following a set curriculum within the space. But actually, once you add in new technologies, actually there's the ability there to satisfy or be able to satisfy different directions within curiosity within people who are learning. And you might have the same classroom, but actually people learning this something that's of equal value, but actually in very different strands within that same sort of subject. And I think that's something that's really exciting, is the ability to move outside of those very narrow bounds of teacher teaching a certain topic in a certain way, and you only walk away with, for example, for us in history, it was a US civil rights movement, and a very limited sort of exposure to what was actually going on within that. But there might have been areas of curiosity that I wanted to pursue further, but that was not an option in the time frame available to the teacher at the time.
I've just had this with my eldest daughter, Daniel, who's just gone through her options. A lovely secondary school, because it's a small school, they haven't got as much flexibility, so she couldn't choose computer science this year, basically. And I was having a discussion with the computer science teacher how it should be compulsory there with English and maths now. Not so sure computer science as a whole, but digital agency or something along those lines, because it's more important than a lot of the stuff that you just referenced in, the national curriculum. You've got to learn X, Y, and Z because you've got to pass an exam which was going to question you about X, Y, and Z. But what sort of strikes me is that we're not teaching the students in general in the education sector, education system in our country, sort of skills that they need to flourish in what's a very, very rapidly changing world. So what sort of would you like to see from your perspective, and knowing all your businesses and the other aspects of their interest you've got? What would you like to see being taught in schools, or what flexible options would you like to see?
Yes, a really good question. So I guess we've been used by several thousand companies from all over the world who are building technology that's at the edge of what is currently possible. And these are in very narrow fields within broader fields. So, it could be space, satellite, communication, encryption, for example. Like companies building in that field space. Pardoning the pun. But there's a company that's developing vaccines for fish in fish farms, so that farmed fish are healthier during their growth.
Big issue in Scotland. Big issue, and the world over. I think very recently, volume of farmed fish overtook caught fish for the first time, which is very interesting, but obviously comes with a different set of problems that you need to solve in terms of that method. And so the education system is, I'd say, pretty good at giving people a foundation. And then at university, there has you're then given the ability to try and zoom off to one of those outer edges, in theory, of what is currently possible. That's sort of where the sort of education, I think, to date has been. But actually, I wonder, it's a hypothesis, given that the cost of accessing that knowledge at the edge has just come down dramatically, and your ability to interrogate and ask questions has also reduced, whether or not we are going to start seeing more people able to sort of hit the edge of what's currently known and humanly possible sooner within their educational sort of careers. And that's, I think, something that could be really encouraged, precisely because the world is changing so rapidly. Actually, your need to hit the edge of human knowledge sooner within that particular field is actually pretty greatly increased if you're going to be sort of actively sort of contributing, rather than sort of to that. No, obviously, not everything is technology, not everything is innovation, but I think that that's a very interesting route and path that the economics would suggest to have been opened up. And so I spoke to some children at school a couple of years ago now, and then year 4, and said, when do you think you should get to choose what you learned? I think it was just after we'd introduced an AI chatbot to them, and they'd be working on the ethics behind it. And they said about year 4, which is about the age of 8, and they referenced building blocks. We know the basic blocks, like you just mentioned, the foundational skills, and we already know what we're interested in, what we'd like to do. So we'd like to see more choice when we get to the age of 8 or 9 upwards. And I thought, you've spoken more sense than most education secretaries for the past X number of years. And sadly, they're going to have to wait until GCSEs or university before they can actually follow their own real interest in things, which is not good for any of us, economy included.
And as someone who sits outside of this field largely, like, what drives change? Who is going to drive change, and what should that change be? And how does it happen? How do you get parents on board? Yeah, I suppose
There's an interesting one from a
questions
national.
the other way, but like, I'm really interested.
Yeah,
there's a national perspective, I think, which is a different one, which is where often the frustration comes from. And I know Matt and I are quite aligned at all the stages kind of that flow through, but at the very top, fundamentally, our education system is based on something that was built for the British Empire, that wherever somebody was in the world, they could learn basic literacy, numeracy, and skills, leave with a set of skills that allowed to be dropped into an organisation, whether it was Australia, India, UK, Canada, wherever. And over time, the natural persuasion has always been, well, if we want to spend money to influence significant change, sadly, political ruling has meant that we always want to implement something that we can invest in, start in, and conclude the evidence from within one electoral cycle. We want the credit for what we've done on that spend because of the political nuance we have. As a result, we always end up tinkering. We always end up introducing projects and pilots of change rather than reflect that fundamental. Now, you see some companies held up to that we aspire to, and they'll say, "Oh, look at Estonia and Latvia, some of those countries. They've really moved the dial in terms of their curriculum." But they had a seismic catalyst. They had a point separating from the Soviet Union where they had a curriculum they wanted to redesign so that it wasn't Soviet-based, that reflected their new opportunities for their country and their culture. And at the same time, we can go to the Middle East and we can see huge advancement, whether it's education, technology, business or not, because they're in a country where the political system doesn't have short changes of leadership. In the case of the Middle East, those countries are there until the person passes away, and then the next person will continue the journey. So at the high level, educational reform is inhibited by our unwillingness to invest and look at long-term sustained change. And the second part, which I can hand over to Mr. Jessop on, and we'll just set the clock running for an hour for him to articulate his thoughts, is because the truth is we don't listen to the school leaders and educators. The platforms say we do, but it never becomes consolidated down into the likes of Matt. Where are they at the decision-making table? Where are they reflected? In our technology space, we'd say, well, every time there's a policy decision around technology in our country, there's always Microsoft, Google, and Amazon in the room. Well, that's the fox guarding the chickens. That's not the way that you move and shift the dial. But I mean, Matt, I'll elaborate because I know you have very strong views on it.
I'm making a bad impression of me here.
Well, we're both bad then, but I think it's important.
I was the calm, measured voice, Daniel. I tend to rant occasionally, but we have similar opinions on it. But I'm very against the current education system. I think the traditional pathway of the British Empire, Victorian times, however you want to phrase it, is valid for some, but it's not valid for about 40%, and that's basic data. And within that, it's restricting innovation, it's restricting children finding out about so much stuff. And I'm seeing schools all over the country banning AI and banning smartphones and haven't got the technology. And I end up just banging my head on my desk thinking, if these schools think these kids are then going home and not straight away going onto it and using it, then they are beyond naive. But then there are frameworks of accountability and national curriculum in the country that are restrictive as well. So, yeah, I do struggle with a lot of it. But then I can't get my head around things like when the pandemic started out. I don't remember that there was a push to get devices up to schools, Daniel, and it was a nonsense push, to be honest, because a lot of the schools didn't have the expertise and CPD, didn't have the infrastructure. But at the same time, there's a World Economic Forum report. Every pound you invest in technology and education is 15 times paid for. I just can't understand why, whether you're a politician or whatever, there's no argument against proper investment in terms of technology, and it would benefit the economy. It's SMEs and businesses, all sorts.
There's a wider perspective as well, Daniel, which try and share sometimes, which is around the world, governments like to compare how they're doing to others. And so one of the drivers for perspectives of how we're doing is things like the OECD, who do the PISA rankings. So around the world, there's a snapshot of 15-year-olds that ask a set of questions very much focused around our core subjects, plus a bit of STEM. And based on that, we say, Singapore and Finland and other countries have a high-performing school system. But that very much plays to the 60% that Matt referenced and not the 40%. And what the OECD are now looking at doing is looking to revise and have a measure of high-performing schools based around the concept of promoting human flourishing, which is very much recognizing that actually the landscape's moving to the things we really value most in this technology-driven workplace: skills, critical thinking skills, resilience, creativity, imagination, innovation, communication skills. All those things that I would argue kind of level the playing field, because actually some of our children with special educational needs or just don't fit the mold of the standard education structure may not be the best when it comes to retaining knowledge and delivering it on demand in a 2-hour window when it comes to their examination system through the year. But in terms of their communication, imagination, and thinking skills, they're exactly what the future employer is looking for. Because the other bits, the academics, we would say, are the big measures. We've got tools like AI that are nibbling away and saying, actually, big data can do those for you. What we want is the more exaggerated, the power skills of being human. So that changes, because if that's what employers are looking for, then surely the education system is to say, well, we need to find ways to measure and celebrate those very human skills as well as those analytical and retention skills.
Yeah, and I think to think about our own company, outside of technology roles, I couldn't give a hoot about whether someone went to university or not. It's about it's the human skills, because those matter far more now, and whether someone's disciplined, do they have the right sort of level of tenacity, are they do they take the initiative? That's something that our education system drives out of us.
Absolutely.
And you have to relearn it in many ways after you leave, or like if you get involved in, I know that the government has also cut this, which I think is really this is an element which I think this is absolutely terrible, when they've cut the funding for cadets. And those are instances where you're picking up traits like initiative taking that children might not otherwise get exposed to. And I think I think it's really short-sighted. And I think actually more of those types of activities are required, not fewer. Very interesting, I suppose a little snippet of fact from world of tech and venture capital, and threading it back through to early influences. If you look at Sweden and Spotify, for example, the founder of Spotify credits the Swedish government with the reason for him knowing how to code and building that business, because the Swedish government, I think it's in the 2000s, early 2000s, gave every child, and that's where, and that single decision, if you look at the amount of value generated by one company alone, forget all the others, and Sweden's got a number of other very successful technology companies, that one decision for that one child has paid for every computer that they've given several times over, and will fund many generations more if that's the way that the government wants to do that. And that type of forward thinking, it's a shame that it took COVID for the government to give up devices. Granted, infrastructure being the schooling infrastructure not being there, I suppose, irrespective of that, the fact that you're putting the capabilities and the tools into someone's hands, some of those children and children will take the initiative and just start pursuing an area of knowledge that they won't get to elsewhere.
Absolutely. I'm conscious shortly we're going to have two people on the speak have lost their voices. I feel like I'm sitting here in a waiting room at a doctor's surgery. Before we wrap up this episode, Daniel, I think tying in with education and investors and innovation, that ecosystem where you provide that spotlight on the people you could go connect with and what you could do, what would be your top tips for anybody listening here who's either looking to take a business within innovation forward, or as an educator seeing firsthand a challenge where they have a solution they could mitigate and would like to create some organization to grow that?
Good question. If you're looking to start a business and you've got an idea that you want to validate, go and find someone who say that they'll give you money for it, as in pay you. They'll become customers. If you can find someone who's going to pay you money for a solution that you're proposing, you're already much the way there. You've potentially validated what that idea is, and the fact that someone wants to give you money, and that then gives an investor confidence to say, I want to invest in the business so that you can grow that product, so that you do get more people telling you that yes, actually we're willing to part with cash for this. And I realize that within educational procurement decisions that might be difficult. Obviously, the assumption that I think there's also the parents, I think, are, with what little disposable income parents have, I think in general, most parents are probably quite happy to allocate quite a bit of that and invest in their child's education. So school budgets and finances are not the only sources of revenue for people who want to build in the education space. And that can form a far easier way or route to market for those who are building. That's because because of the difficulty in accessing funds from essentially central government dispersed via schools. And then the second question was around for educators. Was that correct? Sorry.
I think anybody who's starting on their journey, I mean, you will see lots of organizations who are at that point where they're saying we need to reach out and get that acceleration from investment. And I guess from that point of view, you often will see the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it's the kind of the top tips. What's the most important things you need to communicate, share, focus on?
I think it's the same. I think focus on if you've not got a product that's built yet, find someone who says that they would pay for it, and try and get as many of those as possible. And if you have got something that is built, make sure that people are buying it. And then I think if they're not buying it, find out why they're not buying it, and go and build something that people will actually buy and will love. So I think everything stems from the validation of the fact that you're solving a problem, and then actually that's when people will start investing in creating that future, because you're showing that you're validating that there is a need there. And I suppose that's the clearest signal the market can send, is when someone's happy to pay cash for a problem to be solved. And so I don't think you can start too soon.
No,
even with us, with our, we built an Excel spreadsheet to start with. It wasn't a search engine at all. It was Control F in Excel, and we had customers give money for us to basically do a Control F function within an Excel spreadsheet, and that validated that people wanted to find investors who were interested in their niche, and that's the only proof of concept that we needed to validate. We didn't need to go build a search engine at that point in time. We just needed to validate that people would part cash for a problem to be solved.
It's an interesting one there, because it comes full circle back to education. In education, it's about evidence-informed use of technology change. We want to see that people actually align it, that it's got a purpose and an impact. And so it's back to the basics. Investors want to see evidence that the technology is in need. There's a way of measuring a potential growth curve, and that people have already bought in and validated its benefit. So I guess there are parallels always in these kind of decision-making processes. Right, Matt, I think we've had 40 minutes of deviating around lots of different topics.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much both for having me. And it's been
a pleasure.
Fun.
We're going to send you a LEMSIP in the post.
Sorry, Al?
So we're going to send you a LEMSIP in the post just to help with the throat.
Thank you very much. Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much. I'm going to play a little jingle on the way out, and then we'll be done. But thank you, and Merry Christmas to you as well.
Thanks, Daniel.
Cheers. Thanks very much for having me, Matt. Thanks a lot.